Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is the final webinar in our Artificial Intelligence series, and today we turn our attention to the world of paediatrics. And the first thing that we must all be aware of is that anyone who's currently under the age of 18 is growing up in a world where in real life, digital and augmented realities already coexist. Their exposure to and comfort levels around using and interacting with technology is leagues ahead of my own experience. If I think back to my first home computer, which was a ZX 48K, for anybody old enough to remember, I think that took about 30 minutes to load up. The children and young people that we all work with are social beings. They're growing up in the context of their families, schools, and communities. And so, whilst their additional needs may present challenges regarding access, many of them will still desire and aspire to being part of this social, educational, recreational, and health environment that they know as home. So over the next few minutes, we're going to be exploring this environment and discovering how brain-machine interfaces and artificial intelligence are contributing to and enhancing rehabilitation and therapeutic opportunities for children and their families. Before I introduce our wonderful speakers, a few points of housekeeping to keep everybody on track. To the right-hand side of your screens, you should be able to see the chat function, and this is where you can raise any questions that you have for our speakers throughout the presentations. We're really keen to hear from you, so please do use that chat function. If I could also ask you to put your name and your email address when you're posing any questions, this will enable us to follow up with you individually if we're not able to deal with all of the questions during the time that we have together today. Our first guest speaker is Annalu Waller, Professor of Human Communication Technologies at the University of Dundee. She will be guiding us through what AI can offer ACC to support users to create content-specific communication. And our second speaker is Sarah Daniel, neurological physiotherapist at MOTION Rehab. Sarah will be sharing with us her insights of using AI within a paediatric environment, paediatric rehabilitation environment. Hopefully she's going to be dispelling some common myths and helping us to think about the how, when and why we might use technology in this way. So without further ado, I'm going to be handing over to Professor Annalu, and I'll be back later on with some questions. Thank you all very much.
Good morning. Apologies, I've got a bit of a crack in my throat today, but it's absolutely wonderful to be here with you today to share some of my experience in working within AAC and using AI to support people to communicate more than just wants and needs. So without further ado, let me talk about who I am. I'm one of these very strange individuals where I have a background in computer science, but I am also a registered rehabilitation engineer trying to harness the potential of technology to support those with disabilities. I just wanted to check you can see my slides, can't you, Becky? So I'm going to look a bit behind and look at the past and then come forward, because AI is not new. I have been fiddling with AI since the mid-80s, and we forget that a lot of the word prediction and support for dyslexic children has been around for 30 odd years. And Dundee has been instrumental in doing the early research around how predictive systems can support children and adults with dyslexia, and using color backgrounds, spell checkers, etc. And this is all to advance literacy support for disabled children. And all of this is encompassed in what we call natural language processing. So in the past, we've been very rule-based compared to today, where we can harness loads and loads of data and do a lot of pattern matching. But what I want to do this morning is to just demonstrate how we at Dundee have been trying to harness AI, but with an insight into how we design systems to make them easier and more intuitive for users to use. And the only way we can do this is to continually work with end users. So both the projects I'm going to show you were developed with young children as research partners on our project. And we gave them little labels and name tags, which actually said researcher. And you can immediately see these disabled children sit up straighter because they were actually being told that they had something to give to society. And I think we need to remember that. We need to remember that even the most disabled child can actually contribute to how we develop their systems. One of the areas which I've worked in for 30 years is the area of narrative. And I thought I needed to just say something about narrative. When we talk about AAC and supporting children with little or no speech, we often give them supports that allow them to ask or to choose between activities. But communication is far more than expressing our needs and wants. Communication is developing the skills needed to do the real interaction, which we call interactional conversation, where people are learning the skills around the niceties of how we interact, but also sharing who we are through our stories. These are not fictional stories, although we use fiction to support the development of those skills. And by supporting narrative, we are supporting the potential to learn to read and write, to organize our thoughts, to work through problems within our lives. And the sad thing is that very few children and adults share story. If devices aren't designed for it, number one. And number two, children don't develop the skills they need. And the sad thing is that we are our stories. So without those skills and that ability to share who we are not seeing children grow into the conversational people they could be. I always talk about people with little physical disability, but with learning disability, and they talk the hind leg of a donkey and share jokes and stories. Why can't we facilitate and support that in young people? And if we're looking to develop independence, these are skills we truly need. So I'm going to start off with the project we did in the early 2000s. So it's ancient by now. And we wanted to demonstrate that we could get a computer to generate novel, punning jokes. And it's easy to do. You just have a dictionary full of answers. So this is how brute force AI works. And even AI today, we always have an algorithm or a plan behind what we are getting the computer to do. And so we worked with templates, and this is what do you call a thing template. So we start off with the answer, and we then work out what the joke might be. And one of the ways to do it is to find synonyms for the answer. And here we have a joke. It's not rocket science. AI is not rocket science. It just seems to be magic. So I'm going to show you a video of a child who uses a head switch to operate a scanning interface. And this was an early prototype, so she was helping us to work out how to develop the interface which access the technology I've just shown you. So here goes.
Say again, what do you call a spicy missile?
Spicy missile?
Yes, spicy
Say
missile.
again.
What do you call a
Okay.
spicy missile? I have no idea.
Say
What do you
again.
call a spicy missile?
Okay. Say again. Okay.
No, it's difficult to get
Say
the okay
again.
at the right time.
Okay.
But she's fantastic.
First line. last line. A hot shot.
A hot shot! Well done. That's very funny.
Say it again.
Now, I hope you are all impressed with that. The jokes the computer made were awful, but they were at the level of a young child. And what we found was these children knew that these jokes were their jokes. They weren't jokes put in by therapists or teachers. So their willingness to actually communicate and their desire to communicate shot through the roof, because they suddenly realized the power of taking control and being the person who was driving that interaction. We've also looked at how we can use technology to adapt automatically to support children to explore language just beyond their ability. So often we depend on therapists and teachers to give children that experience of stretching beyond where they are. And what I want to do is to support the child to be able to explore new vocabulary and to get the idea that language is more than retrieving what other people have given you. Now, this is another example of how we give children the opportunity to explore what it is like to tell a story within a context. So the Harvard School Today project took sensor data. It knew where the child was, where they should be because of the timetable, who was around them, what the objects were that they were interacting with, and it then created or generated. We all know about generative AI now. The AI generated sentences for their child to take home. And this is an example.
Then I went to junior primary instead of meeting.
Right. Lolita. Junior primary. Find that most.
Yeah, visitor was there.
Oh, a visitor. Right. What visitors doing?
The dental hygienist came to give a talk.
Oh. Dental hygienist.
Yeah, visitor was there.
Oh. That was a visitor. That's why I went to junior primary. What did you think of the talk?
She's nice.
She's nice.
There
That's
you
good.
go.
Very good.
So the important thing here is that the child gets the experience of driving that conversation. The therapist did not know what had happened the day before. And we are using technology, for example, she is nice, came from pressing the smiley face. And because we had just uttered a visitor was there, the system knew how to respond to that in a positive fashion without the child having to negotiate a very complex interface to find the individual words they want. This is not supposed to be an AAC device. This is there to support the child to build up those skills in a fun, exciting way. So we need to work out how do we give children vocabulary without relying on others to put that vocabulary in their system. How do we support the child to retrieve that vocabulary without having to learn exactly where everything is? And this is part of what gets my goat, is that we're expecting these children to learn how to operate a machine in order to retrieve language, which is a skill beyond what any of us normally do. So the last thing, or the second last thing, is how do we get that vocabulary? And we've been using visual recognition of photographs to actually support adults to retrieve vocabulary around the picture they've just snapped. And there's a lot out there now that actually demonstrates the use of this. And then I just wanted to give you a glimpse of current research we are doing. So we are saying, how can we give people access to more than word-for-word prediction, and maybe give them access to longer chunks of information that they've already used in conversation. And so finally, I've given you a lot of references, and this is a reference to a workshop paper we have just published about where we think AI might be going in terms of AAC, in terms of enhancing the rate, but also generating language for the user. And with that, I will stop and hand back to Carmel if I can actually get back to my stuff sharing. Thank you, Carmel.
Thank you so much, Annalu. I know that there's going to be lots and lots of responses from our audience with the content. And it's really interesting, actually, just to take that historic view of AI just for a moment. And as you say, we forget that actually we've been using this technology or forms of this technology for many, many years already. But it seems like we're still only just scratching the surface in terms of its application. And how we can use it effectively to open up a world of communication, particularly for children. For me personally, you know, the takeaways from your presentation there, absolutely love that focus on children being the researchers and valuing the significant contributions that they are making in terms of pressing forward with advances in technology. And absolutely, you know, it's easy to forget, but we are all products of our own stories, aren't we? And giving people voice is so critical in the work that we do. So thank you very much, Annalu. If Sarah gives me the thumbs up, and I know that she is ready, I'm going to give a hand over to Sarah now. Thank you.
Just share my screen. Are we sharing the screen there, Becky?
Sarah, we've got your full screen, but we don't have the slideshow.
Okay, bear with me.
This is what happens, you see. It goes so well in the practice
so
run.
Well.
We were all so confident. There we go. We're ready. Right.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Thanks for the patience. That's a great start when we're talking about technology. Thank you, Annalu. That was a really insightful and really helpful presentation, and kind of set up for me to follow. So I've been kindly invited to talk about maybe where AI sits within physical rehabilitation. And I thought we'd start off just having a look at the principles of what physical neuro rehab looks like for those of you who are maybe not therapists, and consider the differences that we see when we're working with paediatrics, and then start to explore advanced technologies and AI in rehab. And then I'll hand back to Carmel for questions. So when we're looking at physical rehabilitation following neurological insult, there's lots of information as a therapist we need to obtain that informs our treatment and helps us create that treatment program. So the first thing that is really central to everything that we do is looking at the patient relevant factors. So what is the diagnosis of the patient? What is their age? What is their history? What are the comorbidities and problems that they might have alongside their neurological insult? And then in particular, what is that pathology? What has the injury been? What is the problems that it's caused? And as a therapist, we then look at what the neuroanatomy would be, what the physiology would be, that gives us the resulting physical impairments. And we talk about this in a therapeutic way of being clinical reasoning. We pull all together our anatomy, our physiology, our knowledge of a patient, our knowledge of movement that creates that treatment program. And alongside of that, as a physical therapist, I then think about what the cognitive function might be of the patient, how well they can understand, based on Annalu's presentation, what their communication is. We've got to think about their ability to plan movements, problem solve movements, and also what their engagement and motivation is within their treatment session. And out of all of that, we then need to pull out goals of therapy to give somebody the opportunity to try and improve their physical functions. So what you'll see is that's a huge interaction between the patient, but really it's the clinician that's pulling together and synthesizing information from all aspects of the patient's life to create their rehabilitation program. Now, what I've done in my clinic and the clinicians I've worked with, that we're starting to integrate technology to that treatment planning. So we're augmenting our treatments by adding advanced technologies to add to the therapeutic outcomes of the patient. So alongside that clinical reasoning process of understanding the patient and their physical requirements, we then have an additional knowledge base of what are the devices, what are the indications to use these devices, who do you use them with and why, for how long, to do what are the contraindications, what are the problems that they might cause, and then are there any guidelines or evidence that can help our integration of that technology. So it's really down to the clinician to pull together and synthesize that treatment program. And I want you just to keep that in mind as we progress through the presentation. So we can do that generally speaking, but actually when you start to look at TBIs or brain injuries in children, there's also an added level of difference. And what we have to remember in children is that the cerebral metabolism, so what's happening inside the brain, changes massively in their early years. And despite us knowing that there are developmental milestones of at a stage that a child will achieve head control, they will achieve sitting, rolling, crawling, walking, that's massively different within normal parameters for every child, because it's driven by their individual cortical development. And that's the formation of synapses, connections, nerve connections. It's about how the growth of nerves occurs and what we call myelination, the coatings of the nerves that allows the electrical impulses to travel. And it can create massive changes that you see at a baseline level versus kind of as they progress. So what that generally means is that we can't really approach all children to be an homogenous group, the same kind of group, because what one child can achieve between birth and the age of 8, another child might not be able to achieve. And that's not a result of pathology, it's just a result of different growth spurts and neural development. And we see that amongst children in primary school or amongst children in nurseries. I remember being the mother and having the conversation, my child can crawl, my child is walking, my child can pick something up and they finger food, my child just sits there and waits to be fed. But that's not pathological, but it means that children are very different and we can't compare necessarily what the baselines are. The other impact for children within rehabilitation is that we have very poor or very little evidence in the literature, in the research, on which to base our recommendations. So we've just talked about how we formulate our treatment plan, and some of that is related back to the evidence within the literature. But actually, there is very little literature for children, comparatively speaking, to adults. And some of that is to do with how we provide research evidence. Children are seen as being a vulnerable population with regards to ethics and how ethical it is to include them in research studies, things like RCTs. So it means that what we generally find is that although children are exceptionally different to adults, what we do is we extrapolate data from adult traumatic brain injury studies or adult studies on neurological treatments, and we use those and apply them to children. And the unintended consequence of that is that actually there is weaker evidence to support various treatments, because it's not a neat extrapolation from children to adult or from adults back to children. What we do know anecdotally is because of those rapid changes in the early years, that children are reported to have better outcomes following brain injuries compared to adults for similar levels of insult. So again, it's really hard to use evidence from adults to put it back into children. And the assessments of children, as I said, is extremely difficult because we don't have a stable baseline. What does the average child do? And what was the baseline for this child prior to the injury? Because they're constantly having that accelerated development. So it does pose a problem when we're trying to pull together the best research and the best interventions for rehabilitation processes. So where does advanced rehabilitation sit? Well, we've seen the incorporation of advanced rehabilitations to augment traditional approaches grow rapidly in the last probably decade or so. And the idea is that they don't replace therapy, they don't replace the therapist. What they do is they augment it, they increase, they accelerate outcomes, and they provide an intensity and repetition that we can't do without these interventions. And many of the devices might use robotics to move limbs, they might provide biofeedback, they might provide an opportunity in an environment to increase repetition. We can increase the efficacy of a therapy session because you are working within good biomechanics. And it can increase a challenge based on the performance. So we're getting objective information about how somebody is performing in their therapy session that gives us an indication of whether we can make it more difficult or whether we have to make it easier, or how we increase the challenge for the patient. invariably the advanced technologies are providing huge amounts of data of what's happening in therapy sessions and what the patients are actually achieving. And for some of the technologies, it actually allows us to do things that we wouldn't be able to do without using those technologies. And an example of that might be electrical stimulation. We can stimulate a paralyzed muscle, we can cause a muscle contraction, we can increase blood flow, and we can strengthen muscles that a patient can't do volitionally. And again, some of the advanced rehabilitation technologies, particularly since COVID, when we've looked at telemedicine, it allows us to reach patients that don't routinely have access to healthcare. So we can now reach people in their own homes through their devices and provide remote rehabilitation solutions. But where the barrier sits with the current market of rehabilitation technologies is that the robots that we have are currently dumb. And what I mean by that is they're still reliant on the clinician. So all of that clinical reasoning that we talked about and the principles of neuro rehab that underpin how we deliver therapy, the therapist is now inputting that into a robot to deliver the therapy. So the robots that we're using are supplementary to the therapist, but they can augment it, but they don't support the clinicians in their decision-making abilities. They're not synthesizing the information about the patient, and they're not informing the clinicians of maybe what the best treatment approach is for this patient. And that's really where the advancement of technology to incorporating in AI, I think really starts to look very interesting. So if we're going to have AI in technology, it needs to contribute to the decision-making process rather than the patient, rather than therapists just applying a piece of technology to the patient. So where does that sit? Because as a therapist, that might feel a little bit uncomfortable that actually we're leaving it to a robot or to artificial intelligence to determine what rehabilitation looks like. If you go back to some of the literature, there's some negativity around using AI in rehab. And the first probably experience is that it's not trustworthy. They lack human feelings. It lacks your expertise as a clinician. And it also can't apply common sense, which is what we do as therapists on a day-to-day basis. So we're just going through some of the skepticism related to introducing AI. The other thing is that there's some skepticism about how inconclusive evaluation can be of those patients. So if they're doing the same, can AI use the same clinical reasoning skills to come up with the right answer for the patient? Now, the argument is that if they've got the same baseline measures and the AI has the same inputted data that we have as clinicians, why would it not be able to help with that decision-making process? But the reluctance maybe amongst the adoption of it is because we see this dichotomy in the literature of actually robots are not going to place therapists, but then on the back of it, there's a cost benefit analysis of that actually if we do incorporate robots, we can save costs and we can reduce the number of therapists. So there's a question about whether it can do our job as well. And repeatedly, the literature will say we don't want to replace the therapist, but at the same time, it's a really good use of funds because we can reduce the costs of the therapists. So it does make adoption within the clinical setting really challenging because there is this constant underlying cynicism about how useful it is. The other question maybe about using AI is about the marketing materials that come with it. So unlike in pharmacology, where you have a drug and it has the benefits, the side effects, the contraindications, the dosage, how much you should take, when you should take it, what we see for a lot of technologies, including AI, is very shiny marketed handbooks about this product. We don't have information sheets, we don't have guidelines of how to deliver it, just that this is a really good bit of kit and you should include it in your clinic. So without having that information and evidence to support it, I think again, is this really evidence-based medicine? I would counter that by saying robotics and AI have been introduced in other healthcare settings really, really effectively. So we see them in surgery, and we've just seen actually how they're adopted in communication and areas of rehab in the previous presentation. So why can we not adopt them in physical rehab? So where do I see that AI fits, despite all of those maybe negatives or questions sitting above it? Well, I think it has a role in 3 separate areas: the clinical role of rehabilitation, the social role of rehabilitation, and deep learning for rehabilitation. And I'll come to those individually now. So in the role of clinical interaction, I've just got a little video playing of one of the devices that's currently now, it's robotics that incorporates artificial intelligence, and how it's been used in a clinical setting and a home-based setting. So the first thing that we could do with AI is look at therapy progression. And I think I just picked up on the last presentation that Annalu mentioned, is that how do we explore, what was the wordings? How do we explore to push someone beyond where they currently are? So if somebody is interacting with AI and they can achieve it, then actually we could use the AI to push them further and further and further and monitor their outcomes. And you'll see that the device that you're seeing in the video has cameras and feedbacks of range of movements, how the patient performed, and then it can see kind of within the parameters how well they performed, and then it can progress the therapy so that they can work harder and achieve more repetitions in maybe a greater range of movement or with a higher heart rate to get better fitness. So that's something that could be delivered very easily using AI that doesn't need necessarily a clinician involved in the therapy session. What it can do is provide standardized training. So if we use AI within a therapy session, we can standardize it and repeat it session after session after session, including maybe a therapy progression. And as you'll see in the video there, the AI is providing feedback to the patient. So the patient can participate, they can see what they're doing and how well they're doing it, and they can see where they're falling short. So the feedback gives them encouragement of what they need to do next to improve or get better or to maintain the same quality of movement. And overwhelmingly, it will provide evaluation and objective feedback. And you'll see this particular product, it was just one of many that I pulled off the internet to show you, is that you've got lots of markers and measurements and data of how that patient is performing that then is going to inform the next treatment session as to do we improve the patient? Do we make them work harder? Actually, the data of that last session indicated they weren't very well, so maybe we'll set off and go slower and work at a different rate. So it can monitor the intensity of training, again, in a way that we can't necessarily do with a patient by themselves. So the important bit of maybe using the AI is I've looked at either workforce management within the hospital setting or overwhelmingly in the home-based environment. So whilst I recognise this therapist skills are not to be belittled, I'm a therapist after all, it's trying to work out how much time an individual uses. An individual has access to a therapist, and the majority of the time the patients are by themselves. So we have a real opportunity to provide an enriched environment that is challenging, that is motivating, that is giving feedback for the patient to hopefully increase compliance with programs at home. That then means that they'll be spending much more time on therapy-based activities and enhancing their rehabilitation outcomes. And what I would suggest is that traditionally we've handed out maybe a sheet of therapy exercises for somebody. I think that's becoming increasingly unacceptable when there are lots of technological alternatives to develop home-based therapy. And AI certainly is an area where you could probably deliver home-based therapy remotely. But because it provides an opportunity for feedback and it is learning from each session that somebody does, it makes that opportunity at home much safer, and we can minimise maybe adverse effects moving forwards. I think we've seen a real trend and an explosion in the adoption of technologies, particularly post-COVID, and telemedicine is particularly an area of where they think that they accelerated the trend of telemedicine by at least a decade when COVID came on board. I still have reservations of how well you can rehab somebody over the phone or on a remote telephone call, because you don't really see a great deal. But if we can introduce AI that is learning and seeing how well someone is doing when we're not there, potentially the outcomes for patients will be much better. Crucially, we have to make sure that if it's going to have a clinical interaction, that it's accepted and it's adopted as part of the therapy program by the patient. Otherwise, we're going to kind of fail at the first hurdle. So the next area we talked about was social interaction, and I probably am going to end up replicating a little bit what Annalu has just talked about, is how do we provide maybe communication opportunities for children within their social environment, and we've just had kind of examples of what that looks like. But there's also another role of social interaction where the AI could become the coach or the motivator for the patient. And for children, this might actually be as a beneficial interaction, because we could look at maybe the roles of parents and friends and family maintained in those roles as friends and family, and that they're not the coach, they're not the nag, they're not the person that is pushing them to do their therapy. And it has the potential to really promote relationships within the families and normalise those relationships, so that you're not having family members becoming the clinician, and potentially helps that social interaction and dynamics within the household. Might be there that it's just there to encourage somebody, particularly in the role of rehabilitation with children. This becomes almost a full-time job. Rehabilitation has to probably be very intense for very long periods of time, and it has to be maintained, and it's very, very difficult to maintain that over a longer period of time. So if we can introduce AI that maybe gives them encouragement, that can modify tasks, it keeps them engaged, and also provides them a validated external feedback of how well they're performing, and possibly in some way provide a reward system that makes the individual and the children feel like they've achieved something. Standing up and doing your stretches, or putting your splint on, or using FES, or doing 10 of these exercises, 10 of those exercises every day, when they can't necessarily see their progress and how that's benefiting them. And we must have some role that AI can provide that data. Lastly, I think is probably one of the most important areas that I see AI developing for physical rehabilitation. So there's lots of areas we've talked about there of, can we maybe increase the benefits of advanced technologies by adding AI into it, so that patient does more, it moves more, it's more automatic, it responds better. But within paediatrics in particular, we have an opportunity to use AI to create data and deep learning. And what I mean by that is deep learning is a form of AI that will hopefully radically change medical care. And it's built on the concept that there is a network within the computer system that gathers data from all sorts of areas, that then shows us maybe patterns and can predict behaviours or can predict outcomes that then can inform therapy. So when we don't have data from traditional research trials, can we use the data that AI is gathering during day-to-day therapy sessions that are more realistic than the conditions of a research trial? And we gather that data from children of all ages across the globe. We have a potential to do this. So you do a multi-site research trial is extremely expensive, but we're gathering this data in the back that then can help with our decision making, and we would hopefully be able to see treatment patterns or themes established within that data that can then inform us to create bespoke therapy packages for individuals, but predict outcomes. And if we can predict outcomes, we can then see, well, which interventions are more beneficial, which interventions are better timed at certain stages of the recovery process, which children with certain maybe communication deficits respond to certain interventions. And all of that will help with maybe the allocation of resources, but will help to create bespoke therapy programs for patients and children to tackle their rehabilitation needs. And that's what we don't get out of traditional research models. And by gathering all of this data, and it would be very reliant on the industry at sharing the information that they're gathering, we actually could then contribute to a global research base that can only be beneficial for rehabilitation outcomes in the long term. The other thing that might occur by using the deep learning is that we spot and recognise patterns that we haven't seen previously. So that might be recovery of certain functions. It might be that engagement is better in a certain environment for people, but those patterns would contribute to medical science as a whole to really optimise the outcomes for patients generally. So my overwhelming feeling is that we have maybe a clinical role for AI, we have a social role for AI, but the real exciting development, I think, is this deep learning that can contribute to knowledge of care as a whole for children, and bespoke care for individual children, so the outcomes can be enhanced overwhelmingly. So just to finish, I think the human interaction at a clinical level is extremely complex and multifactorial. We started off looking at what we need to do within a therapy setting to provide a treatment programme. And that means that there are highly developed skills and expertise, experience, knowledge and evaluation integrated into the treatment interventions we give to every individual. And that I'm sure that AI will be increasingly integrated into our therapy approaches, but it's going to rely on intelligent application of the intelligence. And what I mean by that, it's only ever going to be as good as the data that we put into it. So thank you. I hope that was kind of a bit of a stop through of what I thought would be the outcomes for patients using AI in their rehab.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I mean, that kind of feels a bit like a call to arms to everybody on this call, really to say, look, this is coming and we need to step up. We need to not just accept it, but embrace it, run with it, be inquisitive, be curious, ask all of those questions, really do a deep dive to make the most out of what AI can offer to the children and families that we encounter in our day-to-day work. I'm glad to say that we have had some questions come through, and it's interesting that both of you have talked about research and research evidence in your presentations. My question, or the question that's come through, is kind of pulling on that thread, really. How do we get those stories out there? Because we know that the best way of sharing information is through stories, through those case studies, etc., that we will encounter. How do we overcome that problem when there's a reticence to include paediatrics in research? And Annalu, I know that you've been looking at this as well. I don't know who wants to go first. Just jump in.
Oh, and Annalu, I'll let you go first as the researcher.
I have a really issue with research and practice because I think practitioners are meant to do evidence-based practice, but in reality, there is so little time for practitioners to understand current research. I'm thinking of the current sort of buzzword is Gestalt theory for giving children chunks of conversation. And we know that there is almost no evidence to say that that is a good way to go. And yet practitioners and companies are stating it as fact. And I don't know how we get around this, but I do think it's because practitioners aren't given the time, the resources, or the links to keep their practice up to date. Sarah, I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah, I think it does resonate. I think overwhelmingly there needs to be a shift in the field of academia, because we sit still, and I'm kind of 20 odd years outside of a university where the gold standard for research is a double-blind randomized controlled trial. And so the idea that you have interventions and the patients don't know what the interventions are, and then at the end you can see which was the better outcome. And historically, we've known that you can't deliver a double-blind trial in rehabilitation. You can't pretend to research somebody. You can't give placebo, and it's really not ethical to withdraw and not give therapy to somebody. So I think there needs to be a push for data to come out of clinical practice rather than research studies that are really structured, and we need to accept different levels of evidence. And I think this is where AI has the real potential, because what you would be doing is using artificial intelligence as part of your therapy program. It's collecting lots of real-time data, and then because you would have this mass data, we can then pull from that the patterns and the research and support it. Within my field, where we're using robotics and advanced technologies, not necessarily AI, we're already providing data to institutions to look at the data that we're collecting. But we do know that I think there's a paper that suggests that there's a 17-year lag of introducing changes to clinical practice from what we found in research, and we just need to shift that. So we need to start applying changes.
And I think, Sarah, they need to equip practitioners with the ability to make evidence-based decisions, because I don't think we equip practitioners enough into what evidence-based research is. I also think there needs to be a tighter community between practitioners, researchers, and technology developers. And then thirdly, I think there needs to be this awareness that we have to work with our patients or clients to enable them to actually start taking more control over their own therapy and their own outcomes. And I don't think we do that enough in pediatrics. This is something I'm very keen on at the moment, is how many children with disabilities really understand their condition and take responsibility of that.
And I would just add to that, I think that we also need to widen our horizon of where the data can be gathered from, because for children with disabilities, school is a rehab environment, home is a rehab environment, the therapy session is a rehab environment, going to the shops or going to the soft play area is a rehab environment. So if there is a way that we can harness that with technology, then we get a better idea of what therapy should be. And that doesn't necessarily mean in a physio gym with a gym ball and a few hand weights. We really have to be more creative at how we're approaching rehabilitation.
Thank you both. I knew that there would be a flurry of a response from you for that. I'm really conscious that we are close to time, so I'm going to throw out, they were posed as questions, but I'm going to put them out there so that everybody is aware of the kind of where people are thinking. The first point was, how do we explore the role of AI in continuing to motivate children and young people as they progress through adolescence and into adulthood? I don't want either of you to give me a response right now, just something, food for thought. And the other question then is around the associated costs, both in terms of the technology itself and in terms of who might be funding that, which organisations, which statutory bodies, if it's private, how do we drive down those costs? Thank you both so much for your contributions today. I know that that we say this all the time, but these webinar series they just don't exist without the fantastic contributions of our speakers. So I'm really grateful to both Sarah and Annalu for giving up their time today. Whilst we've been chatting, Becky has been popping some information into the chat function for our guests today. Please do give us your feedback. There's a little form there for you to complete. We rely on your feedback to help us to develop future training and education programs, and we are always really keen to hear from you. Also, if you've got any questions still right through to the very end, we will follow those up individually. And thank you to those people who have put forward comments and questions. You will also see in the chat that Becky has sent the link to all of the recordings for the AI series that we have delivered throughout the year. And if you're interested in accessing both this recording and the future recordings, please do follow that link. A massive thank you also to Becky and Amy, who've been behind the scenes and who helped to bring this programme of webinars to life. Before we go today, we've got an extra little gift for you. I was very lucky to be at the International Paediatric Brain Injury Symposium last week, where in and amongst all of the different poster presentations, I spotted one that was really pertinent to this particular presentation. And Sarah Rudbeck and her colleagues at excuse me, at King's have been developing a new app. You can see the link for it there, Recallify. Really interesting bits of information and new research coming out of being able to use this app, again focusing on their work with paediatrics to use it to support memory function, create opportunities for independence, learning, and engaging with their peers as well. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Sarah and her colleagues as well. I think that's everything from us today, other than, again, a very, very huge thanks to both Sarah Daniel and to Annalu Waller. I hope you've all enjoyed listening to what they have to say. Please do feel free to get in touch with them for any follow-up that you might like to pursue. And we will see you again at our next webinar. Thank you very much.